Hey everybody, welcome to Better Make Music. My name is Marcus Gunther and this is episode 4 of the Beginner Beatmaker series. It started with this chord progression. So the way I made this chord progression is like this. I loaded up FL keys and I picked the Rhodes and I just fiddled around with chords from there until I found a chord progression that I liked. Oh, for those of you that care, these are the settings that I use in FL keys. Copy them, don't copy them, whatever. Let's get back to the chords. So from there we have a basic chord progression down, but we can do better than that. So what I did from there was I took the chords and I figured, okay, let's give them kind of a rhythmic aspect to them because I feel like everything that I give a very defined rhythm to will help the rhythm of the beat as a whole in the end. And if I don't, I feel like I'm just leaving something on the table. And it's not like you can't go back, right? You can always edit your things after you're done. So I ended up just playing around with the rhythm of the chords until I found something that was satisfying, and this is what I landed on. So now let's add in our next pattern. Though in reality, we're going to need something more like 3 because the next thing we're going to add are the drums. And those are made up of a kick, some claps, and a hi-hat. Let's break those down in reverse order. The first thing I added were the hi-hats. 2-step pattern, super simple. At a later point in time, I came back to the hi-hats and edited them a little bit. At a later point in time, I came back and edited the hi-hats a little bit to take them away from that 2-step pattern so that they'd match the beat a little more closely. So the next thing I added in was the clap. And stepping back for a second, and this goes for all of drums in the space of making rap beats, people will tell you that making drums is a super complicated thing. Don't let anyone tell you that. Obviously, there's levels to all of these things, but within the scope of making rap beats, drums are not that difficult. It'll seem difficult for about half a second, and then you'll realize it couldn't be much easier. The clap, what it is it's 3 sounds. There's 2 sounds that come together that I layered that make the actual clap sound, and I put those on 3, and the last of the clap sounds plays on 2 and 4 just to flesh out that rhythm a little bit more. It acts like an accent. So now all that leaves us with is the kick, and the kick hits where the kick hits. The whole point of the kick is to define that groove, so in the end you're going to have to listen to your beat and it will tell you where the best place to put the kick is. Though there is another thing that I like to do with my kicks and my beats. What it is this. I'll take 2 kick sounds, the first with more high frequency information. In the case of this beat, it sounds like this. And I'll take another one with more low frequency information. In this case, it sounds like this. And I'll take an EQ the first one, EQ the second one, so that they blend a little bit better than play them at the same time. In this way, your kicks become much more hard hitting, so that when they play together, it ends up sounding like this. So there's a decent likelihood that if you're really just starting out on your beat making journey, that all this talk of layering kicks is going to go straight over your head. If that's the case, forget about it for now. What you need to be doing is you need to be nailing down those basics so you can get to stuff like this in the future. And if you're really taking this seriously and you're really taking in the right kinds of information, give it a couple months and you'll find that you're going to want to start doing this stuff anyways. At which point, come back to this video and we'll take this explanation from the top. From that point on, give it another couple months and you'll find that all of this stuff is magically clicked because none of this is all that complicated in the first place. At which point, think of me and all the fun we had together. But to bring this full circle, the drums are pretty simple, are they not? The only thing left to do then at this point is to take those drums and add those in. So let's do that. So at this point, let's add in 2 more patterns. The first is a lead and the second is a crowd chant. And I'm going to do these 2 together because they're quick and they work together. So the lead is basically just playing the melody and it sounds like this. I didn't really do much with this, it just came to me so I put it in. And you'll find that happens with melodies. And the second sound is a crowd chant and it sounds like this. And basically what I did with that is I took an EQ and filtered out the lows and the highs to give it that lo-fi effect, right? It makes it sound like a telephone or like an old-fashioned kind of radio. And basically the crowd chant plays at the end of every little phrase that the melody plays and it gives it a little bit more oomph as it's moving through it. I like those candles, but they really are a pesky thing to remember. Kind of a headache, you know that? So at this point, basically all the sounds that make up this beat have been added back in. And I'll play that for you in a second. But before I do, there's one thing in particular that I really want to draw your attention to because it's important. Building up this beat, have you noticed how a lot of the sounds fill different rhythmic pockets? It's something I like to look for because it gives the beats a lot of movement. The question I ask myself when making the beats is, how can I make the different sounds complement or play off of each other? And it's one of those things that it takes a bit of practice for you to be able to do consistently, but once you get the hang of it, you'll realize it's not hard at all. So what I'm going to do for you now is I'm going to play the beat, like I said, and I want you to pay special attention to how the different parts play off of each other, because it's one of those things that'll really level up your beat making. Here it is. So now it's time for another new pattern, and we're going to add the bass. So when it comes time to add in your bass line, it generally goes in one of two different directions. The first is a bit more complicated and you got to think about it, but it goes like this. You sit down and you pick out every last note of that bass line until it's right. The nice thing about this bass line though is that when the bass line is done, it is done. It's a good way to go when you need to make a bass line that's a bit busier. The second is essentially the exact opposite in that you can turn your brain off for a second. It's also the type of bass line that I have in this beat. And the way you know when a beat needs the second type of bass line is that without even having added in a bass, you can already kind of hear the bounce of the beat poking its head out like halfway. Which brings me to a bigger point, which is production in the end kind of just becomes a process of having a good idea, because you learn to recognize that if you listen to the beat, it'll tell you flat out every time what it needs so that it can be finished. But back to this bass line for a second, the way I did it is like this. I sat down and grabbed a keyboard, whatever you happen to have, and using only my fingers, I basically just played on that keyboard until I figured out what the bounce of that beat needed to be so that it's right, and then I added it in. Between these two options, that's why I love making bass lines, because you can end up with such wildly different results. On the one hand, you have something that's more minimal and makes a bass line very bouncy, and on the other hand, you have something that's more busy and it gives it a whole lot of energy. If you start mixing and matching the two of those together, there's no telling what kind of bass lines you can come up with. But this time around, this is what we're working with. So now for the last time, let's take another pattern, add that one in, and what this is going to be is it's going to be the verse melody. So that's the melody. And I mean, what can you really say? All you can do for a melody is have some kind of idea and then play around with it until it's absolutely right. But there are two things I do want to draw your attention towards, and the first is this. The melody and the notes I use in the melody follow the chord progression. And what that means is this. The notes I use in the melody match the notes that I use in the chord, and as the chord changes, the notes I use in the melody change as well to match, so on and so forth. And basically what this does for you is it ensures that your melody is consonant. Consonant is a music term that means sounds good or sounds nice, which would be the opposite to dissonant, which means sounds bad or sounds harsh. Another way to put all of this would be, worst case scenario, your melody most likely won't sound horrible. But there are also notes that are in the same scale but are not part of that chord, and those are called color tones. And you use color tones to give melodies more spice or more flavor, but be careful, because on the one hand, if you use too few color tones, your melody will most likely be boring. If you use too many color tones, your melody stops working because it sounds too up in the air or ununderstandable. A general rule of thumb to get started with that is stick to 1 to 2 color tones max per chord, and once you get more practice, you can play around with it from there. So the second thing I want to draw your attention to is this. There's a pretty clear difference between the vibe of the hook and the vibe of the verse. The vibe of the hook feels like it's moving much more quickly and it feels much more upbeat. The vibe of the verse is much more slow and it feels like chill, almost even sad. And as far as the melody goes, you have some options to make that vibe clear. So what it is this. The melody of the hook is much more rhythmic, while the melody of the verse is much more lyrical. And in that same vein, have you ever noticed how hit songs tend to be much more focused on being rhythmic, while songs that are more open or chill or emotional or otherwise like B-side songs tend to be much more focused on being lyrical and emotional? It's our job as a producer to make sure that the vibe of the instrumental and the vibe of the lyrics match so that the song is as strong as possible. Or in our case, our job is to make sure that the vibe of the instrumental is as strong as possible so that when it comes time for the writer to write their lyrics on top, they have as much as possible to go off of so that they can make the song as good as it could possibly be. And in a beat like this, where you have two different vibes that are coming together, you need to make sure that you create a good transition so it doesn't throw the whole song off. In this case, not actually that much is changing. It only feels like a lot is changing. So a simple transition works, but that definitely won't always be the case. If you feel like you're at a point in your production journey where you want to take on this more intermediate or beyond topic of learning how to create effective transitions, especially in situations where you really need a bang-on transition, check out this video. And I bet you'll have a good time while doing it as well, because this is fun stuff. I left the link in the description as well. Can't wait to see you there. So that's the whole beat. But lend me your ear for another second, because there's one more important detail that I want to make sure you really understand before I leave. So at this point, as you've probably noticed, there's a lot in this beat that moves, and they all kind of move in different ways, which, to bring this full circle right to the beginning of the video, that's why this beat has so much movement and why it's like, it keeps it from getting boring, because there's always something going on somewhere that keeps people like in it, that keeps people listening and interested. A lot of times producers will call that making beats that are bouncy. In a certain way, there's other ways you can make a beat bouncy, but the risk you run into when you make a beat like this is that you kind of just have a whole bunch of parts all over the place that don't work together and don't make sense, and it kind of just becomes like a clutter or becomes kind of a mess. And I've definitely been there, but it's something you're going to want to watch out for. And basically the way to correct that if it happens, or to make sure you don't get into that situation in the first place, for me has always been about trying to get a better sense on how I can take different parts and make them fit together so that when it moves together. And it's basically taking all the parts you have and making sure that they play off of each other. One way people will do that is when they're writing parts, they'll leave certain kind of holes there so that they can come in with another part and fill that. You don't need to fill every rhythmic pocket with any part that you make, because then you don't leave room for anything else to come in and fill that. If you've gotten to the point where your beat is done and you feel like it's a mess and you want to fix it, it's go back and edit it, and it's basically shaving away all the parts that don't really need to be there, that aren't quite as strong as they need to be, right? A lot, if not all of the producer stuff that you see is the idea there is add a whole bunch of parts and that will be a beat and it'll be great. And it's there's a lot of truth to that, but at the same time, I'd like to word it a little bit better. Making a good beat isn't so much about adding parts. It's more about adding the right parts and making sure those parts are as strong as they can be. And that probably sounds obvious, but it's not when you're doing it. It's always coming back and asking yourself the question, was this really worth putting in? Is this the best thing I could be doing with this space or with this sound or with this role that I'm trying to fill? And that's kind of a tough thing for a lot of producers, right? Because it's you put it in, you want it to be good, because it's you want to stand behind the decision that you make. And this obviously, all of this is going to take some kind of practice. I'd wish I could tell you this is how you can do it and in 5 days you can be amazing, but that's not really how this works. If you make a beat every day for 6 months though, that's already a different story. And what's 6 months if you really think about it? You know what I mean? 6 months can go by like that. To keep this from getting too long, that's my rant. When you add sounds that move a lot, make sure to mold them around each other, and make sure that when you edit or when you're making a beat, that your sounds are as strong as they can be, because silence is always still better than having a beat or a song that just isn't good or isn't really carrying the weight. So now that brings us to the end of this video, which means it's my time to go, and it also means it's my time to say thank you for watching. If you liked this video or it felt like it helped you learn something, please leave it a like and do all those other YouTube things. I know everyone says that, but it really does help the channel out a lot. Beyond that, my name is Marcus Gunther. Have a nice day, and remember, if you want to make music better, better make music. Now without further ado, the whole beat.